Chess is a two-player strategy game where each player takes a turn to move. The goal of the game, the main objective, is to checkmate the enemy king, which means to attack the enemy king in such a way where they can't get out of it. And you have a whole army to help you with that goal. Let's clear off the board and I'll show you how the pieces move. Let's start off with the rook. The rook goes like a T, up, down, left, and right. So just like a T. It can only move in one direction of that T at a time. So if there's an enemy piece over here, in one turn, the rook can capture that piece. It can only go up to another piece. It can't jump over it like that. That's not allowed. So that's the rook. Next, we have the bishop. The bishop moves like a diagonal, like an X. So anywhere along this diagonal line, it can go to in one turn. So if there's an enemy piece over here, the bishop can capture that in one turn. If there's a bishop over here and an enemy piece over here, in one turn, the bishop can go across the entire diagonal of the board because it's on the same diagonal line. You always start with two bishops. One is going to be on a light square and one is going to be on a dark square. So for the whole game, they're staying on their same colors. This light squared bishop is never going to touch a dark squared color. And likewise, this dark squared bishop is never going to go to a light square. So it is nice to have both of your bishops. So we covered the rook, we covered the bishop. Now let's cover the queen. The queen, you can think of it as a rook and bishop combined into one piece. It can go up, down, left, and right like a rook, and it can also go diagonally. So in any direction, any one direction, it can go and capture diagonally, side to side, any direction, as long as it's in a straight line. Next, we have the king. The king is similar to a queen where it can go in any direction, but it can only go one square at a time. There is a special exception to this rule called castling, which will be covered later in this video. But for now, just know that the king moves one square at a time in any direction. Next, we have the knight. The knight is a unique piece because it hops over to the other squares. It's the only piece that can jump over other pieces. The way it moves is two squares in one straight line, and then to the right or left, one square. And it does so in a hopping motion. I'm going to put pieces wherever the knight can go, and I can explain how. The knight goes up 1, 2, and then over once. So it can hop to that square. I'm going to continue to place pawns to wherever the knight can go. And I'm going to be making a few observations about this. This makes a circle. It's another way to think about it. Also, wherever the knight's going to is a different color than what the knight is currently on. There's also 8 places the knight can go to from here. Because the knight's in the center, it's a good spot for the knight to be in. On the contrary, if you have a knight in the corner, the knight can only go to these 2 squares. So you are much better off having your pieces in the center. That's a big strategy that we'll go into later. The last piece we need to learn are the pawns. Pawns start on the 2nd and 7th ranks. We call rows ranks, we call columns files. The way the pawn moves is each pawn can go 1 square or 2 squares on its first turn. So this pawn can go here on its first turn, or it can go here on its first turn. After a pawn moves, it can then only go forward one square at a time for the remainder of the game. So you can't move twice again with that pawn. Similar, if you even if you just move once, you can't later on decide to move that pawn twice. That rule is only limited to each pawn. So you can move this one twice, you can move this one twice, and then you can move this one twice. It's not restricted to the number of pawns. The only thing that's restricting is on each pawn's first turn. It can go 1 or 2 squares. After that, just 1. The way they capture is a little bit different from how they move. They do not capture straight ahead. They capture 1 square diagonally forward. So if I have a pawn here, and I have a pawn here, that's how the capture is. It's 1 square diagonally forward. Pawns can never move backwards. It's another thing to know. If you have 2 pawns here, like this, can they capture one another? No, they can't. They're both stuck. This pawn can only take if something is on one of these 2 squares. And likewise, this pawn can only take if there's something on one of these 2 squares. Because there isn't, pawns don't take straight ahead. Those pawns are stuck. They can't move. But if, let's say, the opponent goes here, now you can capture because there is something 1 square diagonally away forward that the pawn can take. There's a special move in chess called en passant, where if one of your pawns are here and the opponent moves twice right next to your pawn, you have an opportunity that you can do now or never. You can capture that pawn as if it moved 1 turn, and then you can take it. You can't make some other move and then take en passant. You have to do it either now or never. You don't have to do it, but the option is there for when it happens. It can only happen when the pawn double jumps 1 square directly to the left or right of one of your other pawns. Then you can take as if they moved 1 square. If a pawn gets to the other side of the board, gets to this last rank here, it can become a queen or any other piece. We've covered all the pieces. Now let's talk about the board setup. In the corners, you have your rooks. Then you have your knights. Then you have your bishops. White queen, white square. And then the king will go on the other square. And we'll do the same thing for black. Rooks, knights, bishops, black queen, black square, and then the king on the other one. And just like that, we've had a board set up. Now we know how all the pieces move. We have the rook, knight, bishop, king, queen, bishop, knight, rook, and the pawns. Let's talk about the objective of the game. Earlier, I said that the objective is to checkmate the enemy king. Now, what does that mean? Let's say your king is over here. It's pretty vulnerable to have the king out in the opening, but this is just to show you an example. Let's say later on in the game, I get my rook out like this, and I go here. I'm threatening to take the king. This is called a check. When you're in check, you must address it. You can't make some other random move. You have to do something about that check. You're required to. Otherwise, I'm simply going to capture the king. There's 3 ways to get out of check. You can move out of the way, like this. Now you're not in check. My rook's no longer attacking the king. You can capture the enemy piece. In this position, you can't, but let's say you had a bishop over here, for example. The bishop can capture the rook. So far we talked about stepping out of the way or capturing the piece. Another thing you could potentially do is block the check. So the knight could potentially come here and block the check. The rook cannot hop over that knight, so that knight is jamming itself in the way of that check. So again, 3 ways to get out of check. You can move out of the way, you can capture the piece giving check, or you can block it with another piece. If you can't do any one of those three things, it's checkmate and the game is over. To highlight this, I'm going to show you the world's fastest checkmate, and this is done in 2 moves. Let's say the pawn goes here, black goes here, the pawn goes here. What this does is create a huge weakness for the king, and to exploit it, this is checkmate. The king is under attack from the queen, and there's no way for the king to get out. There's nowhere for the king to go, no places to block the check, and nothing to take the queen. So this is the fastest checkmate in just 2 moves. And a move in chess, by the way, is 1 move for white plus 1 move for black. That counts as 1 move. Castling is a special move where it's meant to help the king get more safe. The way it works is you need to have clearance between the king and the rook you want to castle with. You can castle on either side. I'm going to first show you this side castling. This is called kingside castling. So once you have your pieces developed and out of the way, you have the ability to castle. And what this means is in 1 turn, the king can go twice and the rook over once. And now this creates a nice barrier for the king, and it's pretty safe. You can also castle the other way, known as queenside castling. Once these pieces are out, you can castle this way. So the king goes twice, and the rook over once. There's a few rules to this that you need to know. You cannot move the king before you castle. If you move the king at all, let's say I give you a check and you move the king, or you just move the king first, that eliminates your castling rights. You're not allowed to castle anymore because you moved that king. Also, if you move one of the rooks, like this, you can no longer castle with that rook. The other rook you can still castle with, but the one that you moved, you can no longer castle with. You're also not allowed to castle through check, into check, or out of check. In other words, let's say I have a bishop over here, and you want to castle queenside, like this. You're not allowed to do so, because while you're castling queenside, the king is crossing through this checking line from the bishop. So you're not allowed to cross through check. You're also not allowed to castle out of check. So let's say this bishop is here, giving check. You cannot say, hey, I'm just going to castle and go to safety. Nope, you're not allowed to castle out of check. And likewise, you're not allowed to castle into check. So in other words, no castling queenside into check. You are never, ever, ever allowed to put yourself in check. So that's how castling works. I highly recommend doing so. I prefer castling kingside. Queenside is a little bit risky, but sometimes depending on the position, it could be worth doing so. So now we know how all the pieces move. We know what check is. We know what castling is. Next, some drawing rules. So there are a few ways to achieve a draw in chess. One of them is by agreement. You say, hey, would you like to shake hands and make a draw? And then if your opponent says, sure, let's draw, that's one way you can draw, just by agreement. Another way is the 50 move rule. So if you move 50 moves without a pawn movement or a capture, it's an automatic draw. This usually happens late in the endgame, where there's not a lot of pieces on the board and there's just constant shuffling going around. If the same position on the board repeats 3 times, it's a draw. So for example, say the knights come out. This happens once. That's another move. The same position happens twice. And now it's a draw because the same position happened 3 times. It doesn't have to be immediately in that order. It can be any order. As long as the position itself repeats 3 times, the opponent can claim a draw. There's also stalemate, which means that it's the opponent's turn to go, but has no moves to go. Or if it's your turn to go, but you have no moves to go, but you're not in check. It's not checkmate, it's stalemate, and it ends in a draw. There's a few opening fundamentals in chess that I highly recommend. The center is very important in the beginning. You want to develop your pieces towards the center. Now, what does that mean? Your pieces back here are nice, but they're not doing anything. So you need to bring out your army. And the best way to bring out your army is towards the center. So here's just one example of something you can do. Here, your pieces are very much developed towards the center, and this gives your pieces a lot of options for attacks. Castling early. If you follow these three principles, you're set up for success here. Develop your pieces, develop towards the center, and castle early. Best of luck on your chess adventure.